Hello and welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, hi, you're very welcome. This is Reading the Past and I'm Dr. Cat. And as you can probably see, we are in a little bit of a different setup. I'm very close to you now. And I'm also joined by my esteemed colleague, Lauren Johnson. And as the title probably gives away of this video, we're going to be talking about confinement in the medieval and early modern period. Lauren, could you please introduce yourself to my friends? Who are you? What do you do? And where's your expertise, please?
Hello, friends. I'm Lauren Johnson. I'm an author and historian, mainly of 15th and 16th century history, and particularly women's history. And like you, Kat, I cover an enormous array of different things, from academic studies, research into English Catholic refugee experience in Europe, all the way through to like live interpretation. I've just recently finished up a summer-long programme exploring lesser-known women's stories from the Tower of London. And most pertinently for today's chat, I am writing a biography of Margaret Beaufort, who is the matriarch of the Tudor dynasty.
Indeed. And as well as us working together at the heritage sites on various occasions, when they let us play together, we also have a shared experience of having had pandemic babies.
Yeah.
So yeah. And with all of that entails, so this conversation will be, I think, hopping between our personal experiences, our historical knowledge, and as I always say, we come to history with our own biases. Anybody who tells you they're doing history without bias is either lying to yourself, to themselves, or to you. We're recognising that we've had these experiences, and I'm of the opinion that it kind of makes us better at potentially trying to find an understanding of what's going on. So parts of this discussion will potentially bring up some personal and modern experiences. Margaret Beaufort is fascinating, and I'm very much looking forward to having you back on the channel to talk specifically about the publication that you're working on. But in terms of confinement, what's her deal? What's her connection to confinement?
Her connection...
I suppose also, what is confinement?
Oh yeah, that's a good idea. Because it sounds like being in prison, but confinement, when we talk about women in history, is actually, I think, personally, quite a positive thing. It's the period before and then sort of for about a month after birth, when particularly at like noble royal levels of society, women would cocoon themselves among a sort of a female womb-like environment in their own chambers and give birth, surrounded by people who probably had some experience of it themselves, other women, solely other women, very important to emphasise. And then they would sort of emerge forth about a month after giving birth to something called churching or purification. So it's like this really ritualised set of behaviours, really. And Margaret Beaufort is fascinating because she is so totally not the norm. I think perhaps one of the most famous things about her is she's the mother of Henry VII, who is the first Tudor. You've got, I think, a dragon behind you. So she is literally the mother of dragons, as far as I'm concerned. The Welsh dragon.
I love that. Yes.
But when she gave birth, she was 13, which in itself is really unusual. Obviously, from a 21st century perspective, we think, oh, God, that's awful. How could they do that in the past? And the answer is they didn't that often. Really, they knew it was really bad for you to give birth when you were young. In fact, it's one of the major factors in maternal mortality is how early your first birth is, and then how brief the intervals are between different births. And they knew that because, like, maybe not from the specifics of a medical perspective, but they knew it from experience, they knew it from observation. And the average age for most noble women in the late medieval period to give birth for their first child was 20, which, like, actually is quite late when we think about the fact that they're having child marriages arranged, like even baby marriages sometimes in royal families. So Margaret being 13 is unusual that she gave birth at that youth. And also the fact that, as far as I've been able to unpick from the annals of history, she's giving birth by herself, effectively. She would have had servants around her, of course, but as far as I've been able to find out, her mother, who she is very close to, is not there. She's hundreds of miles away, back in their Bedfordshire or Lincolnshire estate. She has half-sisters. They don't appear to have been there. She may have had some servants who came from her mother's household into her marital household when she married Edmund Tudor when she was 12, just to emphasise the youth of these people. But that's it. And even her husband, by the point she's giving birth, is gone. He dies of plague when she's about 7 months pregnant. So, I mean, just utter isolation for giving birth. And if she is literally just surrounded by these servants, you know, how is she as a 13-year-old, recently married, recently widowed, recent mother, how is she going to be able to express any sense of like vulnerability? We know she's a very small woman. I mean, I hesitate even to say woman, frankly, because she is a child. So there's a writing by her confessor years and years and years later where he's like, look at little Margaret Beaufort now in her 60s. Look how small she is. Apparently she was even smaller when she gave birth. What a miracle. So like, it was, even at the time, people looked at her experience and said, that is not right.
Yeah, because we have this idea of confinement as being a period of isolation, but this is separate. Because confinement, and certainly it gets more does it not get more codified as the period moves on? But there is an enormous amount of prep. Like, we think nesting is a thing. And correct me if I'm wrong, my understanding is that winter, spring, summer or fall, they are in heavily tapestried, warm rooms with numerous other people, with spices burning or herbs burning in the fire. But it is ceremonial. There are objects. They are well fed, well cared for. They have the right foods. The tapestries can't have anything scary on them in case it makes them take fright and have some kind of deformity of the baby because the mother sees a monster, so the monstrous birth happens. There is a very, and it certainly becomes more so, a very strict understanding of what this should be. And we don't know as much about lower women down the lower social spectrum. Would the people surrounding Margaret, if they are simply servants, would they have had access to any of these things? Would they have known she needed them? Would she?
That's a really good question. She probably would have had some experience. She has a younger half-brother, so she probably had some experience of being in her mother's birthing confinement chambers. I think for someone who is rich in this period of history, probably they have a lot more comfort around them. And I mean physical comfort, obviously. Like you say, tapestries, carpet, every surface is sort of muffled and soundproof to create this kind of hushed, calm environment. Yeah, it's very much like what people say you're supposed to do today, like a very calm hypnobirthing experience. I should be moving towards the mic, be like ASMR experience of birth. And she probably did have that. One of the big things that happens in the 15th century is that even from the royal wardrobe, which, as you all know, is not a wardrobe, it's where they keep all the tapestries and things, they tend to get parcelled out to the nobility, and you find mothers and cousins exchanging things. So they'll send each other their tapestries or their birthing chamber, partly because it's really expensive, you know, like one of the tapestries in Hampton Court, for instance, costs the same to make as a battleship. Like, these are hugely expensive items. So it makes sense to share them. But also I think there would be a real like comfort of continuity with those things, that you're using things that, you know, hopefully your sister or your cousin has had a positive birth experience with. Likewise with the sharing, as you already touched on in one of your other talks, like birth girdles and birth rings, cramp rings. There's lots of descriptions of like coral being passed around, which is believed to prevent hemorrhage, for instance.
What, like sea coral?
Yeah.
Wow.
And jet, I think, jet beads is another thing. Both of these, I'm not quite sure why. Maybe they do. They believe to prevent hemorrhage. And there's this 12th century obstetric sort of collection of medical corpus, really, that's called the Trotula because it was written by a woman, Dame Trot. And in that, it specifies, various different things you could do to help a woman give birth more comfortably. But one is that she should have coral around her neck or a magnet in her right hand. And what I really like in the trotula is it says, oh yeah, we think some of these things work. The magnet, we're not sure why, but give it a go.
I mean, the thing is, people today take lots of comfort and calm from holding crystals and feeling that kind of energy. And those talismanic things, whether it is a cramp ring or a prayer girdle or a relic or a rock, if it brings you comfort, then really and truly leave well enough alone to a certain extent. As long as it's not going to be harmful or infective, why would you not?
Yeah.
I suppose I am very interested by the notion of confinement being a more positive experience than history presents it as. However, there is this niggling doubt in my mind that particularly at court, when we're talking about queens who have ladies that maybe they choose, but we know in certain cases, ladies that are assigned to them, are there going to be cases, particularly if you have a potentially unpopular queen or a less popular queen, where she is maybe surrounded by women where some of them she doesn't like, but they have to be there because it's protocol. They have to have their hands on her.
I think it's possible. One of the things, I was looking at ordinances earlier, as you do, court ordinances for giving birth. The thing that really stood out to me is that actually a lot of the stuff around confinement, purification and things, all of that ritual element, that's public. So that's the bit where men are there, and that's the bit where definitely all of those high status women are going to be. Like the baptism, the choice of godmother, that's probably going to be far more about status than necessarily a statement of who you like. But the actual birth itself is quite cloaked in mystery, I feel like. So I wonder if actually in this particular era, this kind of 15th into early 16th century era, if it was a little bit more choice-based. I think certainly when you move forward in time, and we think of Versailles, that absolutely mind-boggling way of having a confinement and giving birth in public and things, that's a really different experience, and I'm completely certain you're right. And it's quite possible for queens in the 15th and 16th century, because they are so unusual, that they would have those people they don't really like about them. But from what I've seen, I think they actually have quite a supportive network of people. The big difference maybe is that if you've got someone who is a French princess who's come to England, perhaps she's been forced to get rid of her household. Catherine of Aragon, we know, loses loads of her household when she becomes queen, and vice versa, English princesses who go to other countries. So they would certainly have fewer familiar people around them, but I feel like they would probably still have a number of people who were helpful.
I mean, that makes me feel a lot better, because I sort of have this horrible idea of being trapped in a room for maybe a month, maybe 2 weeks, maybe 6 weeks, because, dates are what dates are, potentially with women who are not a fan of yours, who you are not a fan of, who are spending their time trying to terrify you about what's going to happen. I don't think that would be potentially calming, shall we say, and conducive to a happy, healthy birth. Do we know what the motivation behind confining a woman for a month before birth and a month after birth? What's the logic that they have? Do we know that?
As so much of maternal and female experience, no, not really. I don't think. I feel like the experience of women in this time, it just is sort of based on tradition and custom. So it makes sense that from a court perspective, you kind of stop performing courtly behaviours when you get to that phase of pregnancy, when it is most likely you are going to give birth. And of course, at that point in history, although people knew it would be about 9 months, they knew quickening was, sort of halfway through a pregnancy. But the exact science of how many weeks it would be until someone was due, was quite flexible. I mean, we have cases of it being completely miscalculated, or possibly of people having sex when they shouldn't have been, as is the case with Prince Arthur, the Tudor prince, who's the son of Henry VII and Elizabeth of York, who's born a slightly suspicious 35 weeks into the due period. So I suspect there's a degree of like just trying to make sure that the mother is definitely fine, that there's people around her. And also, according to the ordinances, there should be all of the people who are going to have a ritual role or a ceremonial role. So the gossips, the godparents, anyone who is going to be at court when the grand baptism of the potential future heir happens. They are all expected to be there. And I think like it totally makes sense that you would have a month after birth, because you're kind of spending time in a little matriarchal bubble. And then with the purification ritual, you come out of that and you step back into the patriarchy. To all intents and purposes, you step back into the normal ritual of court where men do men things, women do women things, but women have to bow to what men say.
Yes, we will circle back to gossips, and we will also circle back to the need to purify and clean. So we do have this incredibly codified and increasingly written down codification. Whether or not those documents are being forged at a time when the protocol is being forged, or whether they are simply recording a much older protocol, I think is potentially 6 of one, half dozen of the other.
Yeah, it's probably the latter, I would say. It's probably that they are taking very ancient customs and they're writing them down for the first time. And actually, there we have examples of court ritual being enacted. It matches. Like, it just doesn't really change a huge amount for birth.
But they feel the need to, this now needs to be written down so we all know what we're doing. No one's going to mess up.
Yeah, which makes sense in the 15th century, to be fair, just because they keep changing kings and dynasties. Like, it totally makes sense. They keep being like, right, well, we've had the Lancastrians, let's get back in the Yorkists. Oh no, not the Yorkists anymore. Now it's Lancaster. It's York again. No, it's a bit mix of both. That Welsh guy who's been in exile for 14 years, have him on the throne. So, like, it totally makes sense why they suddenly decide to write all this stuff down.
Yeah, they need a through line, because the captain at with the hand of the tiller keeps changing hats. So you need somebody to kind of go, okay, you might be different, but here is what court looks like. This is what's going to happen. With Margaret Beaufort, you've talked about how hers is completely different from this. Because she's trying to find somewhere to give birth, isn't she? It's not clear what's going to happen. Do we know how long her confinement was?
No, is the short answer. We don't. Like, it's really frustrating. We kind of know the date her son was born. We know that it happened at Pembroke Castle. Even exactly where in Pembroke Castle was very contested for various reasons. But the big thing to kind of emphasise in her experience is that she has gone from her mother's household, basically, where she's grown up, into the household of her husband, Edmund Tudor. He then has died in captivity of the plague as part of the Wars of the Roses. And she's literally just left in Wales, which at this time, of course, is a place with a completely different language, completely different customs, a war zone, as I mentioned, somewhere where a pandemic rages. And she is just like, well, I have to go somewhere that will keep me safe. Where's the nearest big castle? Oh, Pembroke. There we go. Right, I'll go there. Which is where her brother-in-law, Jasper Tudor, has his seat and is probably around at this time. So it's literally just sort of scrabbling to find somewhere safe and then hopefully to sort of nest in it. But her husband dies in November. She gives birth at the end of January. So probably, she probably has a really miserable Christmas, I'd say. Like, trying to find somewhere, trying to be like, can anyone give me a tapestry? Is there a bishop who will lend me something? But like, none of it's recorded, because at that point in history, she's not that important. Weird as it is to say, she's a huge heiress, but she's still a woman, so it doesn't matter.
And probably they're also thinking potentially she's a woman who may not survive the experience of this birth.
Yeah,
because of how small and young she is.
Yeah, and
it almost certainly does her damage, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely does. Again, there's so little written at the time about it, but there's a few things for me that really suggest that she is psychologically as well as physically damaged. We know, to deal with the physical element first, so we know she's very small. We know that, as I said, her confessor later comments on the fact that it seems miracle. I think he says that that so small a body could bring forth a child at all. It's in Latin, so it's. But that's effectively what he's saying. And as well as being so small, she is so young. I mean, she's actually younger than lots of women are menstruating at this point in history. Kind of 15 seems to be a common age to start menstruation. So physically, she is probably profoundly damaged by this. We have another bit of evidence, which is that much later in life, when she's a grandmother, she and her daughter-in-law, Elizabeth of York, are arranging the marriage of Princess Margaret, her granddaughter. And they specify in the negotiations that they don't want Margaret going up to Scotland to marry her husband there until she's a bit older, because like Margaret Beaufort, she's a very small girl for her age, and they worry that if she's sent there too young, that her husband won't be able to stop himself and he will damage her by forcing his rights on her. So women are protecting each other. I think that is important to say. And one assumes that the traumatic experiences Margaret had probably meant that she knew what that meant, that, that he might hurt her. Also, she is married twice more for quite long periods of time. In one case, she's married to a man who has, I think, something ridiculous, 9 or 10 children from his first marriage. She has, as far as I've been able to tell from household accounts and things, there's no suggestion at all that Margaret is pregnant again, as much as it's difficult to kind of get those little tidbits of information. There's nothing really that would suggest it. And my feeling is that kind of Margaret realises she isn't going to have another child when she gets to probably 10 years after her first child has been born, that she kind of goes, okay, this isn't going to happen. Because it's very noticeable that about 1467, when her son is about 10, she starts to take interest in him, having not really taken any interest at all up to that point, which again, I would say is part of the psychological damage that this has done to her. It's really interesting that she is basically 2 months postpartum and she gets on a horse or in a litter, not completely sure which, and rides across South Wales to get over to Greenport, where the Stafford family are, to arrange a remarriage for herself. She then, within less than a year, is married, is living in Lincolnshire, 300 miles from her son, doesn't see him, as far as we know. And I am convinced that that is her almost scrubbing out that phase of her life, that she's kind of going, it didn't happen. That horrible thing that occurred to me didn't happen. And I just don't think there's any way that if you have had a really traumatic birth, that there can't be a little bit of you that consciously or unconsciously kind of looks at that child and goes, you did this. From a 21st century perspective.
I think from my experience, it either goes one way or another. Either you see mothers who kind of go, I reject this whole experience, or they position it somewhere else. So with my traumatic birth, it very much made me go, it's me and him, me and my son against the world, and everybody else is the problem. And that still lingers today. And I have huge anxieties about being in hospital, and approaching another birth is very, very nerve-wracking because of that. But I think you're completely right. It goes one way or another. And she had nobody to help her manage her potential feelings for her son. Probably the most psychologically safeguarding thing, although she would not have known that term, is to try and put it behind her, because otherwise I can't imagine the terror that she must have felt.
As far as we know, she literally doesn't go back to Wales for 10 years. There's no record of her going there. So I do think that she puts it in a box. And also there's the element in this era that, of course, if you are a rich woman, you can give your child everything they need materially. They will have a suite of rockers, of wet nurses. There's no expectation Margaret herself will be providing food for this child, as in breastfeeding or anything. all of its material needs can be taken care of by someone else. So it can be completely justified to go, well, they're being looked after, they don't need me. I'm going to try and move on. And I think personally that's what she did.
He doesn't belong to her either. He's a Tudor. And if she's going to have any chance of a life, she needs to recognise that he does not belong to her. He belongs to her her deceased husband's family. He's more Jasper's than he is hers.
Yeah, well, legally he belongs to the king, in fact. as did Margaret herself, which is an unusual thing, that like these heirs to the giant estate belonged legally to the king, and then he handed them out to whoever he wanted. In Henry Tudor's case, he hands him over to Jasper, and then there's a different king, and it's a different person. But that's something else.
It's wild. It's wild. But of course, when Margaret is planning for Princess Margaret's marriage, she's doing so with Margaret's mother, Elizabeth of York, whose own mother had her confinement derailed because she had to give birth hiding away in Westminster.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the princes in the Tower, the eldest one, Edward, was born during the weird readeption when the entire Yorkist family is sort of shoved off the throne for a period of months. And I feel like Elizabeth of York, probably some of her earliest memories, because she's about 4 or 5 when that happens, they must have been of that experience of seeing her heavily pregnant mother having to flee from the Tower of London into Westminster Abbey to give birth there. While her grandmother was being accused of being a witch, obviously.
Yes, because of course we're going to put her on trial for being a witch. Of course we are. So it seems to me that there are the best laid plans when it comes to confinement, and it can be very rigid. But of course, when it comes to human beings, and particularly things like pregnancy and national strife and plague and whatever else, the best laid plans can frequently go the way of the best laid plans. But of course, and you mentioned it, I've made a video on it, there is a big shift that happens, and that is the Reformation. And so much of these confinement practices, as with so much in life, it's at this period, it's woven through with faith. And when we've spoken about this, you said something very interesting about how you see the Reformation allowing more male interference into the confinement space. And I would like to talk about that.
Yeah, I totally agree. I totally agree with my previous comment that I'd made. I think that the Reformation is a profoundly patriarchal movement. Like, it might get rid of sort of priests who can't marry, but it also gets rid of the Virgin Mary. It gets rid of chantry chapels in which families commemorate their loved ones. It gets rid of all of the relics, and we know that relics were a major feature of birthing chambers throughout confinements. So a huge source of solace, like a hugely important emotional thing to hang some kind of measure of control on, because of course I personally think there's actually nothing that made me feel more powerless than the experience of waiting to and then actually giving birth. Like, so if you can hold on to a little bone of St. Anthony or something like that, probably would have been quite helpful. All of that is swept away. And the fact that, like, church fabric, we have lady chapels, we have these entire wings of churches that are dedicated to the Virgin Mary, that focus is gone. The comfort of pilgrimage to places, like, so much is eradicated in the Reformation. And it's an element of history that I personally feel, because we're a very Whiggish Protestant country, Catholicism's kind of been presented in history as this negative, superstitious force. And actually, I just think some elements of superstition are quite nice. Some things would have been good for people, and I think the Reformation really got rid of it. And probably women were left really in a state of limbo and uncertainty about what to do.
I mean, it's very interesting to me when you talked about the fact that Margaret Beaufort may well have known what to expect from confinement, because long before not that long, because it's 12 years, but prior to her becoming a child bride and then a child mother, she would have witnessed or would have had an awareness of what the expectation was. And so I often wonder, even, and I said this in my video that I made, even the most reform-minded, anti-superstitious, right on Lutheran or Calvinist or whatever else, there's got to be a part of you when excrement hits fan that goes, but that worked for my mum. And that's what I recognise. And I'm scared what's going to happen now. I'm missing it. And I also think it's very interesting that you see a kind of ramping up of conversations around the time of Reformation. And maybe it's because we have a greater print media, so it could be these conversations have been going on for a long time. But the anxiety about midwives being able to baptise babies, that they're like, should we still be allowing that? But by not allowing it, the psychological, and we do keep talking about that, but I think it's important to point out that the people we're talking about would have no conception of this. Even if you believe that purgatory or the notion of purgatory is superstition, the thought that something might happen to the baby you've born and it not be able to get baptized and therefore not be buried in consecrated ground or whatever else, it actually feels wicked. It feels like the cruelty is the point.
Yeah, it is solely patriarchal. It's solely men taking control of a female-dominated industry. As we know they did of medicine in general, there's an increasing professionalisation, large air brackets around those, of the medical profession, and particularly of midwifery. And yeah, I totally agree with you. I think it is something that is still a part of culture today. This less today maybe from the moral aspect, but the fact that very recently the government has been moving forward with acknowledging miscarriages as, creatures that lived, as human beings that lived and died, and letting people register the existence of those children. Whereas, I personally have had experience of miscarriages, and it's like, where do you otherwise put that? Because I'm not a person of religion. I can't be comforted by the idea that, oh, good, well, my baby's in heaven now, or it's an angel. That isn't there for me because I don't have that faith. So what you have experienced basically is a nothing. And I think it's really important that there would have been some acknowledgement at the time. And yeah, I totally agree. I suspect it's not documented as much, but I suspect that midwives continued to give some sort of baptism, because I don't think people would have been able to bear it if they didn't.
No, I don't think so either. And another thing from the birthing room as well is you mentioned the word gossip. And even today, that word has a very pejorative connotation. It's the most frequent thing is, well, I don't like to gossip. Well, you shouldn't gossip. But that was like a job, wasn't it? It was kind of like a title. So what is a gossip?
A gossip is a godparent. That's the simplest way to think of it. I think the etymology of it is like god sibling, and it's really interesting that a godparent was deemed to have created a relation, a spiritual relation into a family, so that, for instance, let me think how to put this. If Kevin is the godfather of little Timmy, he then can't marry little Timmy's mother because it's spiritual incest. And we have instances of people actually saying to little Timmy's father, thanks for the honour of asking if I'll be godfather. I don't want to be, because I might want to marry your wife if you die. So people really were seeing it in those terms of incest and relationship and things. And of course, at the highest levels of society, it's a really important ceremonial thing. You might get to choose the baby's name, for instance. I don't think it's a coincidence that the firstborn daughter of Henry VII is named after his mother. Everyone in her family is called Margaret, so not really surprising. And she was, although she I don't think she's specifically mentioned as godparent. She probably was. And yeah, it's a really, really important spiritual role for people in this time. And it's one that, yeah, we probably, because it's so fascinating. Like, how did gossip go from being something that was a positive, like, parental influence to like a negative association? Because it's about women, basically. That's the only reason I've been able to find.
Because godfathers exist outside of the birthing room, gossips exist inside the birthing room, and they are the siblings of God. They are women. Yeah, it's annoying, isn't it? But it's. I think it's good to keep those things, those linguistic things, in mind. We've talked about, I suppose, really the kind of the gaps in our knowledge of noble women. My question is that even more so the case? Is there an even greater chasm of knowledge when it comes to non-noble women? What would their experience have been like? How would it have compared to the confinement of a queen, for example?
Yeah, you're totally right. Like, we don't know huge amounts about the nitty-gritty of it. In the same way we kind of don't know much about the nitty-gritty of menstruation, despite the fact that 50% of the population were doing it for a lot of their life. It's one of those things that, like, the biological function of women as mothers is recorded. The biological function of women as menstruating people is not. Like, it's very, yeah. It just goes to show how much of the history that remains is angled towards male rather than female experience. I think we can pretty much assume that if you are a labourer of some sort, and especially let's say it's harvest time, there's a harvest to come in, you're probably not going to be lying in a bed for a month having complete time off. You're probably going to be giving birth in a field. Let's be real. Again, I think networks of local women would be phenomenally important, especially local midwives. But the actual, like, process of how that would have been isn't particularly recorded. There's like bioarchaeological evidence for some demographic things, like to do with the fact that most female remains, it seems like mortality peaks at around peak reproductive period. But interestingly, it's the same for women who are nuns, so it doesn't necessarily correlate with the danger of death. But the demographic evidence that there is seems to suggest that, like, I think it's 125 out of every 1,000 births would probably be a maternal death. But I mean, it's just so hard to keep track of those things. It probably was a bit more dangerous for women higher up the social scale, because often they are giving birth younger. Often they are giving birth at much narrower intervals. For instance, they're not going to be breastfeeding their children, as far as we know. And that means that they can conceive much more quickly. And often they do. They tend to have multiple births, usually 4 or 5 is quite common in the 15th century. And they might therefore be having children right into their 30s. So, like, the older you are, the more children you have, the narrower the gaps between them, and the earlier you start. Every single one of those things is going to impact your immune system and make pregnancy more dangerous for you. And so one study I looked at said that, like, if you're having, let's say, 5 pregnancies, every pregnancy has a certain danger percentage. Over the course of your life, you maybe have women have a 1 in 20 chance of dying in childbirth. It's slightly complicated maths, is the way it's broken down.
But I suppose there's also that's potentially a con to confinement, is that if you are labouring out in the fields or making bread, you're up on your feet for pretty much up until the moment you go into labour. You remain physically active throughout, and physical activity can improve your chances of a quicker labour, of having a easier time of it. So it is interesting that, because I think we often think of wealth as a protective factor, but potentially when it comes to our medieval and early modern counterparts, wealth and privilege when it comes to childbirth may have had the opposite effect to being protective characteristics.
Yeah, totally. You maybe are a little bit cleaner. That's an advantage. But
yes, yeah, that's definitely an advantage. Field births, I think, would be a bit dicey. Could be. when it comes to that, talking about cleaner, when it comes to that postpartum period and the need to be churched, when we've been talking about confinement, and particularly pre-Reformation confinement, as this, in some ways, very positive feminine space, there's always been that need to have a ritual cleansing, as if the process of birth is dirty. And for me, those things almost sit in opposition, that you have this wonderful, ritualized, powerful, in some ways, feminine space of confinement, but then still dirty lady must have wash. I can't get those things to correlate in my mind.
Yeah, it doesn't massively make sense to me either. Apart from, like I say, I think there's an element to which, like, you know, Middle Ages loved this kind of topsy-turvy thing where they'd be like, right, 364 days of the year, you have to be completely within this patriarchal pyramid. For one day a year, you can have a lord of misrule and be a bit cheeky. You know, you have a boy bishop or whatever. And I feel like probably there's something similar happening with the confinement chamber. It's like, most of your life you must be oppressed by men, but for 2 months a year you get to hang out with women, and then you need to get that womaniness off you to come back into normal society. And I mean, also, because we recently discussed this, there is a degree to which actually maybe you kind of need a little, you know, a little sorting out when you're 5 weeks postpartum. You might welcome the opportunity to have had quite a lot of sitting for a while, hopefully on a comfortable cushion, and then to actually get up and re-enter the world at that point. Again, like you, had a very unusual experience of pregnancy. I was pregnant in the pandemic and gave birth in the January pandemic. My kid didn't meet anyone until it was like 10 weeks old. So it was totally different. But all of the birthing books that I read were like, well, be careful of introducing them to other people too soon. They might get ill, you might get ill. So I imagine there's a kind of a commonsensical element to it as well. Is it sort of like you get this amount of time to be looked after a bit and to protect your immune system, and then you must haul your leaking breasts and bleeding bits out into the world.
And also, can we talk about the sweat?
Yeah.
I don't, maybe it's just me, but you after you give birth, it's like, I mean, I've started early this time. Your hormones, I am sweaty all the time. And when you have a small human, you don't smell great. And certainly, if you had been stuck in one room for 4 weeks, you would hum. There is just no, I don't care how much they're, you know, rubbing your feet with perfumes. You need, at that point, a full body immersion of some description, because you are ripe. Right.
Yeah, that's going to.
But of course, you also don't want them getting in a bath. It can't happen like a week after, because they still potentially got a dinner plate sized wound in their internal organs. You don't want them getting in a bath of potentially not massively sterile water.
Yeah.
So it's that kind of, in some ways, it makes some sense that you leave it time to heal, for everything to kind of regulate a bit, and then you're like, okay, let's pits and bits, love, pits and bits.
I am actually wondering as well, and this is not something I have experience of, but I wonder if we have this particular level of society who are being discouraged from breastfeeding, is it that maybe their milk dries up in that time, that it enables them to have one less element to deal with? I'm not certain of the biomechanics of it, but I wonder.
I mean, yeah, because we don't know how they would stop we don't know, apart from, like, we assume they bind their breast, we assume they probably take some herbal remedies. We don't know what their process is, because we don't have it written down, a kind of, at this day you will do this thing, at this day you will do this thing. So it's very interesting that at some point they must have had their milk dry up, either because they intervened or not. And yes, if that is the case, that all of that kind of, all of the leaking will have diminished by about 4 or 5 weeks. That's very interesting. That's when churching happens, I think.
A lot of the kind of postpartum recovery to your delicate area is also hopefully going to have happened by that time. That, you know, you will no longer be in danger of hemorrhaging, for instance, by that point.
From what I've seen, it's certainly not a baby is born and it's immediately 4 weeks. It's baby is born, time passes, and then it's decided that it's now time to church her. So have they waited for those things to stop? And whether that's 5 weeks or 6 weeks, have they gone, right, we're okay, let's go?
Yeah. And in fact, there is an example from Henry VII's time where, I think it's 1489, there's an outbreak of measles at court at the time that everyone is there for the baptism of this baby Princess Margaret. And also they're there to see Prince Arthur become Prince of Wales. So like the court is packed, and measles like just runs through the court. It kills one of the ladies in waiting, and the entire court leaves. They have to run basically to get out of there. So it could be a very dangerous time as well, potentially.
Yes, all of those bodies crowding in, keeping the mother in the room with the infant for those weeks. It's exactly what we're advised to do now. It's, you know, don't let too many people close to baby, etc., etc. I think in our discussion today, we've balanced it. We've talked about the pros and the cons, potentially, of what we know of confinement. So one of my final questions on this topic for you is, are there any aspects of the medieval or early modern birthing experience, confinement, that we don't do today that you would like to bring back?
Well, it would be nice to have 2 months just sitting down, I have to say. As someone who gave birth at home and then had to get a taxi to hospital and sit on a wooden chair for a day, the day after giving birth, that wasn't ideal. I know. I do think as well, and this is because I have not had a normal birth experience, but like I do think there is something in that companionship of having lots of experienced people around you. I presume, again, have no experience of this because pandemic child. I presume that's partly why people have baby showers and things, is that it affords them NCT classes. It gives them an opportunity to kind of gain that knowledge from the people around them in a modern society where we are much less used to sharing our space. In the Middle Ages, you know, a servant slept in the same room. Children might sleep in the same room as their parents lower down society. You might have 3 generations all in one shed with a cow. Like, I think we're quite divorced in some ways from the physical elements of it. And I think it would have been really nice to have had a support network around. Who knows, maybe even for people who didn't give birth in a global plague, that would also be a shared experience that they would like.
The village. And for anybody who doesn't know, I know a lot of people in America what NCT is. It's a thing we have here called the National Childbirth Trust, and they do classes on pregnancy, childbirth, baby safety, but it also is it's a great opportunity for women to meet each other, to meet the partners. And frequently, I mean, we did our NCT online because pandemic, but to have people who are giving birth within sort of 2 or 3 weeks of you. So in those early weeks where everything is weird and changing all the time, you have people who can text at 3 a.m. being like, is anybody up? Has anybody seen this? Is this normal? And it can be very comforting in this separated world. I think, yeah, the loss of the village. I also think that something that to me seems evident, but I don't have the evidence to back it up, is that it's not just noble women who are relying on other women to feed their babies. It takes a while for milk to come in. And for some women, it takes a lot longer than others. What we do know is that babies can lose their birth weight really quickly. That is to be expected, particularly for breastfeeding babies. And it can develop things like jaundice and lethargy and make it harder for that baby to thrive. It doesn't make sense to me that all across the social order, if you have women who are lactating and a mother who has yet to start lactating, that they would not put somebody else's baby to their breast. And when that starts happening, And when that is what is going on within your village, your community, your society, it does make the process of establishing breastfeeding and getting a healthy baby feeding a whole lot easier, I would imagine. And it's just not something that is certainly not where we are. It's not considered normal that you would feed somebody else's child. In fact, if your neighbour was like, it's all right, and took themselves out and tried to feed your baby, like, whoa, 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 whoa. But I imagine that did happen. I can't prove it.
Yeah, it seems to make sense.
The loss of the village is, I think, the thing that I would love to see come back. And you never know, maybe it will. So, lovely, Lauren. Where can people find you on social media, bookstores, etc.? Where are the locations of you?
Most social media for me is at history_Lauren. I apologise for the punctuation. It's because obviously there is another history Lauren in the world. And you can buy my books anywhere you like. Shadow King, So Great a Prince, Arrow of Sherwood. And then in 2025, my Margaret Beaufort book. Google Lauren Johnson history. I'll probably come up. There is a 12-year-old in America called Lauren Johnson who sneezed for a really long time. They might come up first.
I love that for you, but excellent. And I am very much looking forward to 2025 and to talking to you more about Margaret Beaufort outside of her birthing room, because she lived a long, fascinating and storied life. And I'm very much looking forward to seeing what you have discovered about it. So please do stick around on this channel, because Lauren will be back to talk about her book. And if you have liked what you've seen, please make sure you have subscribed to my channel. Do hit the bell icon. That way YouTube claim that they will tell you when I've next uploaded and when I'm next going live, which I do to talk about the history news. I know you're not going to want to miss that. You can also come over to my website. It's www.katrinamarchant.com. If you put your email address in the contacts page email box, I will add you to my mailing list, and that way I can send you out an email once a week with all the links to my content for the coming days, and also to let you know what I have been up to. I want to say a massive thank you to Lauren for joining me and us indeed, and giving us all of her time and expertise. And I will speak to you all very soon. But for now, do take care of yourselves. Bye-bye.